Hello, Steve Donohoe here. This is a talk that I occasionally do called Beekeeping by the Numbers. It sounds terrible. Hopefully it's not. I'll just go and share my screen. Let go. There we go. Okay, so here we have a nice avatar of yours truly, looking a bit younger and more handsome than the real thing, sadly. So this idea of beekeeping and numbers, I'm not talking about anything too complicated. Simple stuff. Charts I'm a big fan of charts, and that's just turning numbers into pictures, which we can all relate to. Of course, in nature we get quite a range of variable outcomes. So the idea of using something as specific as maths might seem a bit odd, but it does give us pointers, and it can help very much with planning, which in the winter time there's no beekeeping to do, so it's good to have a plan for the season ahead, even though, as we all know, it probably won't quite go to plan. But anyway, don't need to be a genius, I hope. Okay, so many people will have seen this kind of slide, the three casts of bees, and down the right hand side is days, and each one of these U-shaped things is a cell in honeycomb. So in the case of a worker, that's when an egg sitting in the cell on day 1, and day 21, a new worker is born. And what happens is you've got 3 days as an egg. Day 1, the egg's sort of standing up. By day 3, it's laying down. And by day 4, it's a tiny puddle with a little larva in it that you can barely see. And if you were queen rearing, that's the one you want to graft, the really tiny one. About 5.5 days, which I'm going to call 6, as a larva, and then 12 days as a pupa or sealed brood. This whole thing is variable. It varies by the type of bee, and it varies by the temperature. So, but most people go with those numbers. So over here you can see the ratio 3 to 6 to 12. That's what you're going to get. It doubles each time. So if you had 3 eggs, you would expect 6 larvae and 12 pupa, assuming that the queen was laying at a constant rate. And the phrase bias means brood in all stages. So that means you've got eggs, larvae, and pupae in your hive. So these numbers lead to this kind of classic depiction of a brood frame. So you've got your sealed brood, you've got larvae, you've got eggs. Around the edge of the brood is pollen, and up in the corners, honey. And I may not have drawn it exactly right, but you can see you have approximately double the number of eggs as larvae, and then double again the pupa. So that's kind of a standard depiction of what you would expect to see on a frame. It doesn't work like that all the time. In fact, quite often you can get a whole frame of wall-to-wall brood, but this ratio of 3 to 6 to 12 eggs to larvae to pupae, often in the middle of the season with a laying queen, you'll get that ratio across the whole brood nest. So it's not necessarily what you see on one frame, but it's what you see in the whole brood nest. Here's a picture of some newly drawn comb on a plastic frame. And the black plastic makes the eggs show up very well. This is just showing that transition from the brood area. You can see the eggs here into an area of pollen at the edge of the brood. And there's some eggs, but lots of pollen. And then over here, you've got puddles of nectar. So that's transitioning out into the honey section. Also, that's a drone, that big one, sat next to a worker, so you can see the size difference. And also you can see these two workers side by side, how they look quite different. This one's entirely dark, this one's half and half. That happens because they have different dads, same mum, which is the queen, but sperm from different drones. And this is one of my frames from late summertime, I think. I use Langstroth frames. So you can see this big chunk of sealed brood there, the pupae. And you probably can't see very clearly, but around the edge, you do have a small amount of open brood and then honey up in the corners. And there's some cups here, which I just have a quick look in them, but I just leave them alone. Now, what's going to happen is this sealed brood will emerge and become bees, and the open brood around the edge will become sealed, as shown here. So this is a different frame, but it's basically the same idea. And this area here that was sealed brood has now become empty. And in the springtime and early summer, this would be the prime place to look for eggs. If you wanted to quickly see if you had a queen, it's much easier to find eggs than it is to find the queen. And she'll nearly always lay in these newly emerged cells. But in this case, they're empty. So something's afoot. I think the queen had just slackened off on her egg laying because it was getting late in the season. And this is a different sort of frame, which is a stores frame. So a bit of honey at the top and lots of pollen. And these are often found at the edge of the brood nest, or if your colony were to go queenless, they tend to produce quite a lot of frames like this, because the workers are still out foraging for pollen and nectar, but there's less and less brood to feed. So they build up more and more stores of pollen in the brood nest. And that'll all get sorted out when the queen starts laying, when a new queen is produced. But I don't mind if that happens, and I've got a lot of these frames in a brood nest. I can borrow them and give them to other colonies, and particularly cell builders. So they're a good resource. Anyway, the point of all this ratio of 3 to 6 to 12 or 1 to 2 to 4 eggs, larvae, pupae is that we know what normal looks like. We know what we're expecting to see. So if we see anything different, that's a clue. It helps us to try and figure out what may be going on. In this case here, I'm saying that there's lots of sealed brood in the hive, but no eggs and very few larvae, maybe a few older ones. So what that means is, for whatever reason, the queen has stopped laying. If she had been laying, you'd see eggs and young larvae, and so she's obviously stopped. So this sets off a few alarm bells. Has she died? If she died, you'd expect to see emergency queen cells. Or has she swarmed, in which case you'd see swarm cells. Very often for me in maybe August, there's still a queen, but she's just having a break. So a lot of people think they've gone queenless towards the end of summer, and quite often, well, yeah, it's quite possible that they're not queenless, that she's just not laying for a while. But nevertheless, the fact that you're not seeing the ratio of 1 to 2 to 4 is giving you a clue that something's afoot. And the opposite is, of course, that you've got no sealed brood at all and plenty of eggs and larvae. So that means that you certainly have got a laying queen, but she's only just started recently. So it could be a newly mated queen, or she could have had a break and started to lay again. I've just put this note here because I think it's important, is that if you first open the hive in the spring and you have a quick look inside and you see no sealed brood, the chances are you're in trouble, because the queen will have started laying probably in January, certainly in February, and by March, April, when you're looking at frames in the hive, you really would expect to see some sealed brood, and sealed brood stands out easily. It's easy to see. If you haven't got any, you probably haven't got a queen, or you've got a dud queen. So that's that. Colony dynamics, the changing population across the year. So this chart here, the yellow line is the number of bees in the hive, starting off the 1st of January and going across to the end of the year. And obviously you can see the peak time is in the middle of the summer. The dotted line is the brood in the hive, all of the brood, the eggs plus the larvae and the pupa. So what's happening here is that the population in the early season begins to decline, because these bees, they've been in the hive since October time. They're sort of 5-6 months old, and they're getting a bit knackered, and they're dying off. And although the queen has started laying, the number of bees being produced, the new bees coming on stream, is less than the old bees dying, and so you get a drop in population. And there's this crossover point sometime in early March for me, when it turns around and the number of new bees being born, because the queen's ramping up her laying, the number of new bees coming on stream is bigger than the number of bees dying. And so at that point, the colony really starts to take off very quickly. And that's when you're over the worst of it. Once you get past that point, which is probably when dandelions start to flower, you're in the clear. You know, you've got through winter. But this period here in kind of February, March time, that's when you're going to lose quite a few colonies to starvation if they weren't adequately given stores in the autumn. So it's a time to heft hives and feed if necessary. The other thing is I referred to around about August time, sometimes the queen goes off laying for a bit. That's shown here. And then there's a peak, a sort of separate peak in the autumn, which is her laying the winter bees. And those bees are the ones that are going to stay in the hive right through winter and into the following spring. They're critical for the survival of the colony into the next season. And you don't want varroa mites infesting this lot, because varroa will make the virus, the deformed wing virus, the amount that much higher, and that will shorten their lives, and they're going to dwindle over the winter and into spring. So very important that these guys here are healthy. I'm not going to read all these words, but basically you can see this, the pink numbers here are showing typical laying rates of queens. So the peak laying rate, May, June, July time, and very little in the winter. You can calculate the laying rate of your queen if you really want to. Don't really know why you would want to, but the easiest way is to look at all the sealed brood in the colony, and you can count up how many frames of sealed brood you have. So in this case, on this frame, I've got half on one side, and if it was the same on the other side, then I've got half a frame of sealed brood. And I'm told, I don't really use national hives, but most people seem to. I'm told you've got about 2,200 usable cells per side. So in this case, if that's half of a side of a frame, half is sealed brood, that's going to be 1,100 cells. And so you can count up, you can go through your hive saying, that's got a quarter, that's got a half, that's full, and add up how many frames of sealed brood you have. And when you get the total number of cells, divide it by 12, because that's how many days, as we saw at the very beginning, that's how many days sealed brood is there for, and then you'll get your laying rate. So in this example, I'm saying if you had about 5 frames that looked like that, then that would be about 11,000 cells, and divided by 12, you're getting just over 900 eggs per day as the laying rate. So using, okay, so now also you can work out what the maximum brood is likely to be in your colony if you know the laying rate, because you know that brood is only there for 21 days. It has to be, because from an egg to a bee is 21 days. You can't be any longer. So the 21 days times the laying rate will give you your maximum brood. And I've assumed in the summer when they're busy, the workers last about 38 days. So if you wanted to work out how much bees you will get from that brood, it will be the maximum brood times 38 divided by 21. The other thing is, when you're looking at sealed brood in a hive, bear in mind that that's going to turn into bees quite quickly, and one frame of sealed brood is going to be about 3 frames of bees. So, you know, be aware of the need for space. So this fleshes out what I was talking about before. So in this case, this is the brood. If our queen was laying 1,000 eggs a day, the most brood you're going to have in the hive is 21,000 cells, which in a national is about 5 frames. So if you can see 5 frames of brood in your brood box, then that's the laying rate. If she was laying at 1,500 eggs a day, you're getting up to 7 frames of brood. And if you have one of these magical prolific queens that lay 2,000 a day, you're going to have 42,000 cells of brood, which is about 9.5 frames. It's pretty well a full brood box. An actual full brood box, wall to wall, totally every cell filled, she's going to be laying at about 2,300 a day. I don't think that's very common. And alongside the amount of brood in the nest, this is the theoretical maximum colony size based on that brood, assuming that they live 38 days. So with your small 1,000 eggs a day queen, she's going to max out at about 38,000 bees, which is not a big colony. It's about 2 brood boxes full of bees. More common and more, this is what most people probably have. Most people probably have somewhere between these two. But 1,500 eggs a day, you're going to end up with a maximum theoretical size of about 57,000 bees, which is a decent sized colony. It's about 3 brood boxes full of bees, or a brood box plus 3 supers. Bear in mind that you need space for bees and you also need space for honey. So just the brood box and the 3 supers for bees, plus more for honey. The prolific queens, the ones that can do 2,000 a day, they can have very large populations. Obviously, they're harder to manage in the sense that you've got to be careful that they're not prone to swarm. But they're the ones that you make your honey off. Which brings me a little bit to supers. Given that this is a sort of standard expected look of a colony population over time, and in my case, the honey flows are in May and July mostly. If you're running a single national brood box, which I don't, but if you were, then if they were following this pattern, it's going to be pretty well full of bees around about here, about 20,000 bees. You've got a brood box full of bees. So you need to be getting the first super on just before then, which can be as early as the beginning of March in my area. And that first brood box needs to be comb. It needs to be drawn comb, not foundation. They sometimes see a box of foundation not as space but as a barrier, and they'll throw up swarm cells before you know it and be off in the trees, even in early spring, because they haven't been given enough space. So this is the value of drawn comb. At this growth rate you're needing, and with national kit, you're needing to slam on supers pretty rapidly. It's about once every 3 weeks. And so by the time you get to the end of April, you could easily have 3 supers on your brood box just to deal with the population explosion that's going on in your hive. And I don't know if everyone does that, and that may contribute to swarming and just simply not being aware of how much space they need. Obviously, at some point you have to put foundation on it if you want to get foundation drawn. And so the best time is lots of bees and a honey flow on. This is a hive that needs a super. There's the cover board with the feed hole, and they're building wax, and they're definitely looking for space. So these guys need a super. And here's a nice strong colony. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 supers, bees all the way through. So that's what we're talking about with one of those prolific queens. So honey. I stole this from Randy Oliver's website, link at the bottom. The idea here is that it shows along this x-axis, it's got the number of bees in your hive. So around about 20,000 is what I'm saying is a brood box full. So here's a brood box, and then this is one of those larger colonies. And the blue area is the foragers, and the rest of them are the housekeeper bees, the ones that are feeding larvae and doing various duties in the hive. So when you've got a small colony, like a 10,000, half a brood box of bees, it basically you've got half of your bees staying at home and half of them flying. Whereas if you look at one of these giant colonies with 60,000 bees, you've got only about a quarter of the population as stay-at-home housekeepers, and 3/4 are out there foraging for honey and pollen. The other thing is that this dotted line is the percentage of the queen's maximum laying rate that she's able to do. If we take this half a box of bees, half a brood box of bees, 10,000 odd bees, the queen can only lay at about 50% of her maximum, because there aren't enough bees to look after any more brood than that. So what happens is, as the population grows, she can lay more and more eggs, until when you hit a point of around about 22,000 bees, just over a box of bees, she's able to then lay at her maximum rate. So putting that into a table, along here we've got the number of bees in your hive, small hive, big hive, and this shows the split between foragers and housekeepers. So this is the percentage of housekeepers. So with a small hive, a large percentage stay at home, and obviously a big hive, many more foragers. This it's from some research I was reading about, done in, I believe it was Nova Scotia, in the 70s, but they took different sized colonies and measured how much honey they produced. And what that shows is that the amount of honey per bee goes up as the hive gets stronger. So as this small hive here is producing a pound of honey per 1,000 bees, this giant colony is producing a lot more, 1.5 pounds per 1,000 bees. And people often say, well, why is it that a large colony produces more honey than two small colonies? And you can see some of the reason here. So this large colony, 60,000 bees, has got 48,000 foragers there. Whereas if you took two hives of 30,000 bees, you've still got the same number of bees, but if you look at their 20,000 odd, times it by 2, you have not got anywhere near the number of foragers. So the one big hive has many more foragers than the two small. And in a honey flow, that does mean more honey. But not only have they got more foragers, as shown here, they're making more per bee as well. So that's an extra boost there. And the reason for that, I believe, is that, I mean, I don't know, but I was thinking about this, and like, why would a larger colony be more honey per bee? And I'm thinking that they've got more scout bees. So as soon as a tree or a field comes into bloom, the larger colony with more scouts will find it first. They've got more foragers, they'll be all over it, they'll get a head start on the smaller colony. And they also have much less chance of being robbed. The small colony might well be robbed by the big colony, but not the other way around. Plus, there's something about the scale and the efficiency. It's a bit like how many builders are building a house. One builder might take a very long time, and whereas 3 builders could do it really a lot quicker. And there's something about the number of bees being greater is just allowing them to be more efficient and more productive. So what happens when they swarm? If they didn't swarm, as we saw before, they would carry along here along this red line. But this yellow line shows what's happening with a swarm in May. And obviously the number of bees has dropped significantly because half of them have disappeared over the hedge. And also the amount of brood for a while dips because the queen goes, and it takes a while for the virgin queens to emerge and to get mated and start laying again. So you're losing brood and you're losing bees. And if you look at the gap between a swarmed colony and one that hasn't, it's behind all the way. It's behind all the way up until basically autumn. So that's a big loss of bees at the time when your honey flow is on. If you did lose a swarm in May, I've assumed here that before the swarm you've got just over 30,000 and half of them disappear over the hedge. That swarm of 16,000 is actually largely made up of the younger bees. So you're not losing 16,000 of foragers. A large number of them are the younger bees because they're the ones that are going to quickly build wax and make a new home for the swarm. So you're losing about a third of your foragers. Is that right? I don't know. Yeah. Well, you're losing some foragers for sure, and you're losing a laying queen. So when you roll forward to July, if there was no swarm, you've got your 52,000 bees, but if they had swarmed, significantly less, and they won't catch up until too late. And translating that into lost honey, based on the numbers that I was looking at before, this is kind of what I would expect a lost swarm to do. It's basically you've lost 20 pounds of honey. It's quite possible that it would be more, but I'm going with that. And at retail prices, that's around about 180 pounds worth of honey that you've just lost by losing your swarm. And that's quite important, I believe, because if you think about that colony, it needs looking after. It needs varroa treatments. It might need feeding sugar. There might be some old comb that needs replacing, bits of maintenance. And all of that would easily be covered by this 180 pounds. And in fact, you'd be ahead. So if you don't lose a swarm, you're definitely going to be financially ahead, and your colony can cover its own costs through honey that it produces. Whereas if you keep on losing swarms, it's just, not only is it a bit frustrating, and it's financially not great. And on to the subject of finances. This is a smallish bee farmer that I know, and some numbers that he's kindly let me have that based on averages over the last 4 years. And I've listed some costs here and compared them with a mythical 5-hive hobby beekeeper. And these costs are nothing to do with startup capital, nothing to do with buying hives and buying extractors and all that stuff. It's just your day-to-day running costs. So in the case of the bee farmer, we've got significant costs of running a vehicle and fueling and taxing it and so forth. And because he's running around pollinating and moving his hives to crops, I put a small amount in, 12 times 5, 60 quid per year for this guy. So it's just a little bit of petrol. I've assumed that they're not, that a hobby beekeeper's not moving hives particularly, but you probably do use a car maybe to to drive to a trade show to pick up some new equipment, or maybe to collect some supers from an owl apiary or something. Staff costs, bee farmer has them, hobby doesn't. Then there's feed costs, medication, and so forth. The bee farmer will have discounts on some of the things they buy. So they'll definitely get discounts on varroa treatments and sugar, but they may typically use more of that stuff than the hobby beekeeper. And my bee farmer here, he buys in quite a few queens, and he's also bought in some nukes. But anyway, these are the sort of typical ongoing costs. And the long and the short of it is, for the bee farmer, it's costing him £148 per colony, just to keep the thing going, and maybe for the amateur about £75. And at the bulk price of honey of around about £3.40 a pound, I think it's about 100 quid a bucket of honey, isn't it, for a small bucket? It means that the break-even point for the bee farmer, he needs to make over £40 of honey just to cover the costs. £40 per hive. For the hobby beekeeper, it's less. It's more like £22 per hive. But, and this is a critical difference, my bee farmer here is making a huge average honey crop per colony, because he's moving his bees from crop to crop to crop throughout the year. So his bees are always working and always bringing in honey. And that translates to a cost per pound of his honey of just about £1 a pound. So for every pound of honey his colonies make, it's cost him about £1. Now, with your hobby beekeeper, according to the BBKA honey survey, typically beekeepers make about £25 per hive on average. So that doesn't mean every hive makes £25. That means of his 5 hives or her 5 hives, possibly you get £60 off one and £40 off another, £20 off another, and then nothing off the others. And this translates into a much higher cost per pound of honey. And the way that you make this number go down, the best way is to make more honey per hive. So if you were to have 2 supers of honey on every hive full of honey rather than one, you're almost caught up to the bee farmer in terms of profitability. And of course, any surplus that you make by selling honey at above these prices will go towards paying off some of these costs that you incurred when you set up. So for a bee farmer, they've got huge costs with a honey room, a warm room, the big extractor line, maybe several trucks, and so forth. But even the hobby beekeeper, you've spent a lot of money to become a beekeeper. Hives are not cheap, bees are not cheap, extractors, it mounts up. So even though it's a hobby, it's worth thinking about, trying to make your colonies pay their own way. On a different subject, but to do with numbers, is the heating of honey and the production of this thing called HMF. The law says that you must have less than 40 milligrams per kilogram of HMF for it to be sold as honey. That's not much. You have way more than that in jam, golden syrup, Coca-Cola, and so forth. But based on some research done by someone I met in New Zealand a few years ago, who runs Airborne Honey, these are how many days it takes to produce 30 milligrams per kilogram of HMF at these temperatures. And this, you can see how this would be a problem in a hot country. So if you're in a hot country with honey sat around at 30 degrees centigrade, it could be only 100 days before you're at 30 milligrams of HMF per kilogram. And so that's a challenge. But for me, the main challenge with honey and heating is I've got this enormous great bucket of rock solid honey, and I need to put it into jars to sell it. So I have no choice but to heat the stuff. But it's comforting to see that even if you heat it to 50 degrees Celsius, it would still take about 4 days to get anywhere near being in trouble with the amount of HMF. And there's no way you would do that. I typically heat it to around about 46, 47 degrees Celsius for about a day. So I'm not getting anywhere near the danger levels of HMF. And I think heating the honey you'll always lose something, but there's no other way. You have to do that to get it runny and get it into jars. And lots of people don't buy honey if it's granulated, so it is a problem. And it also raises the question of what is raw honey. People use that term, but in all honesty, anyone who's got a significant amount of honey, they're going to have the problem of it's crystallized and I'm going to have to heat it. Okay, Varroa. So National Bee Unit says try and keep down below 1,000 mites in your hive, and definitely not above 2,500, because that will put the colony at significant risk of collapse. Interestingly, they say it's not possible to eradicate Varroa, and they will always be in honeybee colonies. There are very few places where that's not true. And here's my old favorite Randy Oliver Varroa model spreadsheet, which is quite busy, and I'm not going to go through it too much, but the important thing is this light yellow section is the number of bees gained from the 1st of January to the end of December. So you can see, as we've seen before, population decreases, hit the crossover point, bang, they expand, and so on. The darker shading is the amount of brood in the hive, and the very dark is the amount of infested brood, Varroa infested. And this red line of numbers shows the population of Varroa mites. And I've enlarged it here to make it easier to see. So in this typical example, we're starting off with 80 mites, which is around about 1 mite per 400 bees, 0.25% infestation, nothing scary or high at all, probably quite a sort of typical number of mites for someone who's treating. And if we just roll it forward through the year, you can see these kind of mite numbers. So it's getting to a point in the autumn time with 7,000, 9,000, 12,000 mites. They're going to crash and die. And if they don't die before winter, they'll be dead in the spring. This blue line is related to doing an alcohol wash, which is something that I do in June. Basically, when you take a sample of bees, about 300 bees, which is about half a cup, you put them into a jug, a beaker thing, with some isopropyl alcohol, rubbing alcohol, swirl it round, the Varroa mites fall to the bottom, and you can count them. And in this case, in this example, we've got 6 mites, and that's a 2% infestation, which is the generally accepted threshold when you should treat. So if you did an alcohol wash in June and you found 6 mites, you'd think, oh God, I need to do something about this. And the reason is, if you don't do something about this, you can see what's going to happen. It's just going to get worse and worse, and then they're dead. So the benefit of doing these alcohol washes is that you can know what's coming. So this is a typical treatment regime, and one that I've done fairly standardly, fairly normal kind of treatment regime, where you hit them with a treatment in the late summer when you've taken the supers off. In this case, I've said thiamol or amitraz, so that would be, I don't know, Apigard or Apivar, and I've said a 90% efficiency. So you put that into the model, and you can see it drops the number of varroa, kills them off. And then there's another treatment there in the winter that I always try and do, the oxalic acid, when they're broodless. So you can see here, we start with 80 mites, we end with 80 mites, and they didn't die. So the reason I've said alive but not well is, if we look at these mite numbers, they're way above what the National Bee Unit was saying was healthy. You know, by the time you get into August, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 mites. It's not just the mites, it's the viruses that come with them. And this is averaging between June and October about 3,000 odd mites. So even if I'm doing that, and even if my colonies are alive, they're not at their best because of the number of mites. So how would you deal with that? Well, at least for now, while amitraz is working, and there's talk of in some areas that it's losing its effectiveness, but I've not seen that personally. But if you were to hit the bees with some amitraz early in the spring, very early on, you knock them right down. And then if you continue with your normal thiamol and then oxalic, so you've got 3 treatments across the year now instead of 2, this is typically where you'd be with the mites, which is fantastic, very low. The thing I don't like about this is you're just treating everything, and quite a lot of colonies don't have a problem with mites. They do, but not they'll be fine with 2 treatments, and you're giving them an extra one. It prevents you from spotting the colonies that are perhaps better at dealing with varroa than others. But this would definitely keep your mite levels down as long as amitraz continues to work. This is more what I do. What I do is, as I said before, I do the alcohol wash in June, and then I can see. So if what normally happens is, if I've done this oxalic acid the previous season, if I've done that properly, and when they're broodless, then when I do my alcohol wash in June, they've only got kind of 2 mites per 300 bees. 1, 2, 3. Those are the sort of numbers that I see. Whereas one year I forgot on a couple of apiaries to do the oxalic acid, and then in June they were up around 8, 10 mites, which was way too high. So my plan has been monitor the mites in June. If it's low, don't treat, and if it's high, treat. And the only thing that you could treat with was formic acid, MAQS Max or Formic Pro. That you can't get hold of Max anymore. And Formic Pro is basically the exact same product with a different name. However, it turns out, and I didn't know this when I did it last, it turns out that you're not really meant to use formic acid with supers on, bizarrely, because the other product that was identical, you could do that. So, you know, basically I probably broke the law that year, and if I was going to stick strictly to the law, which I obviously have to do, I wouldn't have that option of treating them then, which isn't very helpful. But if you do that, you can see you're keeping your mite levels on average below 1,000. The other thing, of course, is in this, as you can see, you started with 80 mites and you ended up with 30. And what that means is that next year, your starting point being 30, you probably find you get to June and they're fine. They don't need that formic acid treatment. So selling Randy Oliver's Varroa model here, if you monitor the mite count with an alcohol wash, you can compare it to the model. You can tweak the model. So, example, if I did a mite wash in June and I had 10 mites, then I'd have to increase this starting number, maybe put it up to 120, 140, until I got 10 here. And when the chart agrees to what I see in real life, then I know what the future looks like. Equally, I may only find one mite, in which case I can adjust it downwards. So yeah, you can tweak the model to agree to your findings and predict the future. Safe strategies for Varroa. So that was my preferred one. Check them in June with an alcohol wash. If they're high, then zap them with formic acid, and then, as always, treat in the autumn after the supers are off, and in the winter when they're broodless. Trouble is, that's not legal theoretically. Well, it's not theoretically, that's not legal. On the plus point, you're only treating those colonies that need it in the summer, and it allows you to select more mite-resistant queens for a breeding program. Downside, formic acid killed about 30% of my queens, generally the old ones, but nevertheless, it's still a lot of queens that are dead. The idea here of an early treatment, an early spring treatment with amitraz, and then an autumn treatment, and then a winter treatment. Plus points, you don't even need to monitor for Varroa in those cases, because you're zapping them, you know, throughout the year. And also another advantage of that system is that you can push the autumn treatment back to September, which is good for people who are going to the heather, because they don't come back from the heather until September. And if you hadn't treated them in spring, they're going to be heavy with mites. Downside, amitraz resistance is showing up in some places. So how long can we do this for? The normal strategy, treat them in August after the supers are off, and then treat them in December or November, December. Works well when your starting mites are low. Downside is some of the ones that are highly infested, they're just not going to make it. You're not going to, if you won't know, but they'll just die in the winter. And bees returning from the heather will be treated too late. This one here, I don't treat my mites and I don't monitor them because I've got Varroa resistant bees. And I do hear that. It's fine if you live on Colonsay. Otherwise, your bees will have high mite loads and probably die within 2 years. And what's worse is that your highly infested colonies will spread varroa to other hives in the area through drifting and robbing. And even if you find that 1 or 2 of your queens are good at dealing with varroa, the next generation, it almost certainly won't get passed on and it'll be lost. So the idea of not monitoring is crazy. I perfectly accept that if you monitor your bees and you monitor your mites and they're low, then fine, don't treat them. But you can't say, I've got super bees that can beat varroa without proof. And the proof is doing the alcohol wash. So mating. Nature favors diversity. This is a typical pattern of mating area. So here's my queen in her hive, and there's a drone over there in a hive. The drone flying to this congregation area, drone congregation area, and the queen flies there to be mated. And that distance, the distance that the drone flies plus the distance that the queen flies, is the mating distance. And if the mating distance were within 2.5 kilometers, that's about half of matings. And nearly all matings, 90%, happen within this 7.5 kilometers distance. But in my case, within a 7.5 kilometer distance of my queens, I've got something like 300 drone congregation areas and something like 650 other colonies around here that are producing drones to mate with my queen. So it's a lot. And this is a typical sort of setup with numbers that I've seen from some research done. I think it was in the Hope Valley. But basically, you've got about 200 colonies providing drones to a drone congregation area. They got about 14,000 drones visiting there, and a queen comes along and mates with 17 lucky drones. Except, of course, it could be anything. It could be 2 drones, or it could be 60. But most people quote 15 to 20 matings. So I've gone with 17. It's possible that that's understating what's normal. But anyway, point is, I can control the queen, but what are the chances that I can influence the drones that she mates with? For me, no chance. I've got 40 odd colonies. That there's no hope. A big bee producer, queen producer with loads and loads of hives, they can dominate the area with their bees and their drones, and they've got more of an influence. Isolated mating stations and instrumental insemination is the only real way to have any control. And the thing that I can do, and the thing that I think everyone else should do, is to kill off your rubbish queens. If you've got horrible bees that sting you all the time and they swarm lots and they make no honey and they're just rubbish, get rid of the queen, put a good queen in there, and then the drones from that colony are just improving the bees in the area, because if everyone did that, the drones in this congregation area would all be nice, and then the queens that get mated there, well, they've got a better chance of being good. The subject of polyandry, which is multiple fathers, basically, It's quite interesting. There's these things called hyperpolyandrous queens, which were referred to in a paper by Keith Delaplane, Giles Budge is in there too, and others. Um, they did an experiment with, what they did was they inseminated queens and controlled the amount of different types of sperm that they used. So they used, some queens were inseminated with the sperm with 15 different fathers, basically, and 30 and 60. And then they were able to look at what happened to those to the bees and how they performed. And it turns out that the more fathers, the better. So this is what nature wants. Nature wants bees to be inseminated by multiple drones, and they also want to spread that genetics far and wide. That it's the mixing up of all this genetic material that creates subfamilies within a colony, and each subfamily, which is made up of groups of half sisters, so they've got the same mum, different dads. The more of those you have in a colony, the more chance there is that the bees can cope with whatever comes along, changes in climatic conditions, parasites, diseases, all sorts of things. And they found that the ones that had more polyandry, more dads, they made more brood, they built more comb, and they had lower varroa. So nature wants the queen to be mated many times by many different drones, which is another reason why I'm very much in favor of pumping out as many good drones as we can into our local areas. Finally, on numbers and beekeeping, I keep records so that I can tell how I'm doing and try and improve. So here's some of the things I measure. I measure my winter and summer losses, the amount of honey I get per hive, the percentage that tried to swarm, which is basically making queen cells, and the percentage of swarms that I lost, which is me missing something. And also because I raise queens from grafting, there's the step from grafting to a queen cell. They don't all make it. And then I put a queen cell in a mating nuke. They don't all get mated. So there's a loss at each step here. And I could typically start with 30 grafts, maybe end up with 15 mated queens. And I obviously do, as I said before, the alcohol wash in June, and I'm recording and looking for the queens that manage to keep have colonies that keep the lower numbers of mites, and that's part of my selection process for raising the next generations. I like the ones that have lower mites. So there we go. That's the end of that, and I hope you enjoyed it.